Hi everybody, today I'm going to review the book Essentialism by Greg McKeown. And I actually listened to this book on audiobook first, and as soon as I was done, I went back to the beginning and listened to it a second time, which I've never done with any book before, and I've listened to hundreds of books on audio. And now I checked it out from the library so that I could do this review and lend it to some friends, and you can see that I've tagged it up with lots of sticky notes. In this review, I'm going to try to stick to the essential points and follow some of the suggestions that I learned from this book. So one of the first tenets of this book is based on one of the things I've talked about before, which is the 80-20 principle. And in that principle, it states that the minority of causes have the majority of effects, and that most of what is happening in the world is just noise or unimportant information. And that's what this book is all about, is how to sift through the noise and focus on those things that are important. Part of the difficulty with this approach is that we live in a society where we have lots of options, lots of choices, most of which is noise, most of which is trivial, and our culture tells us that you can have everything. The problem with thinking that you can do everything and have everything is that it's easy to be distracted from the 20% or 10% of things that are actually important. So this book gives some ideas and some encouragement on pursuing a path where you focus on those things, and that allows you to not only do better at those things, but to also live in a more relaxed way and not be in that constant state of stress where you're trying to, at the last minute, cram everything in and things end up falling off the table because you don't have enough bandwidth to focus on all of it. In this approach, the essentialist approach, you intentionally and deliberately eliminate things from the table before you get started, and that way it's a choice, and it's you can make better decisions about what is important and what is not important. One of the good things about getting this book in a physical copy is there are some tables inside that help organize information, and there's some sort of like diagram type thing. So this is what non-essentialism looks like. So this is how most people in our society works. And then over here, this is essentialism, when you're really just focusing in on the important things. And in this table, it talks about some of the characteristics of the essentialist versus the characteristics of the non-essentialist. So for example, the non-essentialist tries to be all things to all people, and they operate with phrases such as, it's all important, how can I fit it all in? And the essentialist operates with phrases such as, only a few things really matter, and what are the trade-offs? So a lot of people don't like to think of trade-offs, but everything that you do in life has trade-offs. If you're going to try to be an Olympic athlete, you're not going to be able to put as much attention into other pursuits in life. So you can see how this applies to some of the other videos that I've done and other things that I'm trying to do in my life. One of the really important things that I found in this book, and that I've seen it has been coming up in other places, is that we live in a time when there's more options and more choices than ever before, and more freedoms. And for the most part, that's a really good thing. On, like a human rights level, that's a really good thing, because some of our ancestors lived during periods where they were slaves or serfs, or women had hardly any rights or things like that. And so today we live in a time where we have more choices than ever before. But one of the problems with that, and this is a quote, is the free individual is only free to the extent of their own self-mastery. And I think that's like Socrates or Aristotle that said that. And so we're faced with a dilemma in this day and age because no one teaches us in school how to be our own masters, and most people don't practice it. Instead, we live in a society that tries to sell us all these things and says, you can do this, you can do that, you can do all of these things, but we don't get any classes in how do you decide what you value. So the challenge for us in this day and age is to learn how to manage ourselves and master ourselves, because we have more choices than ever before. Another important tenet that this book starts with is that based on people who have worked in hospice or as nurses, they've found that at the end of life, most people, the most common regret that people discuss is they wish they had the courage to live a life true to themselves and not the life that others expected of them. And so part of the path of essentialism is figuring out what are the things that matter most to you and focusing on those and not getting distracted by everything else. One of the problems today with social media, for example, is that it's really easy to get distracted by all the things that other people value and to not be able to focus on the things that you value. And that's a recipe for an unhappy life. There's a couple terms that this book uses and concepts that this book uses that I think are super helpful. It does talk about the 80-20 principle, which I think is great. And it also talks about the word priority and the etymology of the word priority, which I think is very interesting because basically the word priority comes from Latin, and for hundreds of years, priority meant one thing, just like primary, principle, all of those words come from the same root, and it meant one priority. And then it wasn't until the last 100 years during industrialization that the word has now crept into being able to mean multiple things and having multiple priorities. So this is indicative of how we try to have multiple number one things, but how can you have multiple number one things? You can't. You cannot do 5 things as well as you could do one thing if you focus on that. And that sort of sums up a lot of the philosophy of this book. One of the important things to understand about essentialism is it doesn't require that you don't try out lots of different things. And this is really good for me to hear because I like to try out lots of different things. And the idea is that the essentialist does that in a deliberate way, so they experiment with a lot of different things so they can figure out what are the essential things for them to focus on. And the essentialists also create space or boundaries around their creativity and their work and their exploration so that it doesn't get interrupted. Another concept that I liked in this book was this idea of being a journalist of your own life. And so I thought this was really interesting because it talks about how journalists need to pay attention to the lead or figure out what the lead of a story is. Like, what is the essence of the story, instead of just paying attention to all of the details. And so we can apply this technique to life and find the signal in the noise. And we can also hear what is not being said and scan to find the essence of the information. I thought that was, and also the author mentions journaling and the importance of journaling in the life of an essentialist, and this author does journal, so I thought that was really cool because obviously I'm obsessed with journaling. Another concept that was good was that the essentialist practices saying no, and this is something that I see coming up a lot lately, so I think this is something very important, and Tim Ferriss talks a lot about this, but saying no is an art. And if you look at successful people, they all know how to say no, because part of this paradox of success is as you become more successful, you get more and more requests, and if you say yes to all of those requests, you get spread too thin. So it's very important to learn how to say no, and in our culture that can be a difficult thing to do, especially with social media and all of our forms of communication and the indirectness of a lot of people in our culture and communication styles, and more concern about being polite than protecting our own boundaries. So the essentialist doesn't say yes to everything, and they have a narrow and explicit criteria for what they're going to collaborate on or say yes to. And so this is something that I've been working on and trying to get better at, is how to say no. And one of the important things about it is realizing that because you say no to someone's request doesn't mean you're saying no to the relationship. So making a distinction between a request and how you respond to the request and that relationship that you have with that person or organization or whatever. Another important concept is that the essentialist has a clear idea of what their mission is. And so I do this with my values, and I have them written down. And when I come to a place where I have to make a decision that's difficult between what is essential and what is non-essential, I look at my values. And so an essentialist has a strategy that is concrete and inspirational, and they have an intent that is both meaningful and memorable. And they try to make decisions that eliminate 1,000 later decisions. So this is something that I've always thought about, is I try to solve things on a systems level, and this resonated with this particular aspect from this book, is that if you can find the root problem and solve that one, then there's like 100 other things that you don't have to worry about. Another concept that is brought up in this book that I think is really important, and I've talked about it in a previous video, is the sunk cost bias. So there's this bias where if you've already invested resources and time into something, it's harder for you to pull the plug on that thing even when it's not working, because you have this feeling like that you've already put money into it. And it's important to realize that that is a bias that is inherent in the human brain, and that it's a psychological, it's been tested psychologically, and so you don't have to feel bad about it, but just be self-aware and try to realize how that could affect your decision making. And you have to be able to cut your losses instead of just continuing to throw money and time into a project that's not essential. Okay, so in this book they also talk about boundaries, which boundaries are super important, and boundaries shouldn't be seen as something that limit you, but they actually are something that allow you to put lots of energy into the things that are essential. And so by setting these boundaries in advance, then when things happen down the road, you will be able to stay strong. So for example, creating boundaries around your work time. If you're working on writing a book or doing a painting, for example, and you give yourself 3 hours every morning during which you will work on that project, and turn your phone off, that's creating boundaries, and people will come to respect you for your boundaries, and your friends and your coworkers and all of those people will respect you more because you hold strong boundaries, and that will allow you to actually get work done instead of being in a reactive place where you're bouncing around responding to other things that come up. Another great thing in this book is this another type of bias. It's called the planning fallacy, and the term was coined by Daniel Kahneman, I believe, and he has a great book about biases and fallacies called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the planning fallacy is this, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, is when someone says, it's going to take me 2 days to finish this project, and it actually ends up taking them 5 days. Or someone says, I'll be there in 15 minutes, and they end up being there in 30 minutes. And so the idea is that most people underestimate how long something will take them. And so the solution is to add 50% to any of your time estimates, because that's probably the degree of error. And so this is another bias. So this is something that's inherent in the human brain. So being self-aware will help you deal with this, and having systems will help you deal with this, because if you're just left up to your own devices, you will underestimate how long something will take you. And one of the last things that I think is essential from this book is the idea of routines. And similar to boundaries, is routines are a way that you create a system so that it doesn't rely on your default processes or reactivity. It's you set something up in advance, and when you set something up in advance, it really allows you to think about like, what are your priorities, what are your values, and then you set up that routine in advance, and then you stick to it. Then little things won't bubble up and ruin your creative time or your productive work, because you've already created this routine that doesn't give you those choices. And so this wraps back to the beginning where I quoted that the free individual is only free to the extent of their own self-mastery. And one of the ways that you master yourself or manage yourself is by creating routines, creating boundaries, and creating systems that you set into place, and then you follow those systems. And because you're following those systems, it's harder for you to fall out of that routine or that practice, because you've already set that system up and set those routines and created those boundaries that protect your creative time and your productive space and your decision making. So this book is really great. I think it's good for students, for entrepreneurs, pretty much for anybody. It's a good balance between philosophy and also very practical and very oriented to getting things done, and it is applicable to all aspects of life, from work to personal life to hobbies. And I think it's really good medicine for people like myself who are interested in pursuing a lot of different things. How can you combine essentialism with being a well-rounded generalist? And that's something that I'll talk about more in a later video. So I highly recommend it. It's good on audiobook, but also good in the hard copy that you can get at a library or anywhere. Check it out.